Good afternoon, folks. Over the past couple of months, we've spent a lot of time in grade 12 economics looking at the role of government within the macroeconomy. And the majority of our focus over that particular period has really looked at the role that a government can play in terms of acting as a stabilizing force within the economy. In particular, we looked at the idea of the business cycle. We noted that the cycle is something that tends to occur on its own in a capitalist economy, but we also discussed the idea that when you have major recessions, or even sometimes periods of major growth, where perhaps there's risks involved within the economy or need on the part of the people for support, governments in the 20th and the 21st century, is really since the Great Depression, they've taken on the role of doing something. And doing something often involves using the fiscal tools available in terms of a government's budget and spending powers, as well as the monetary policy tools available to a central bank in terms of things like changing interest rates, making it easier or harder to get credit, changing the liquidity value of assets within the economy. All of those things are used in order to try to either grow an economy in trouble and sort of push up on the trough and make things a little bit less problematic for people, or to try to ever so slowly slow down an economy that's peaking so that you don't have that collapse that occurs because overconfidence sets in too quickly and inflation starts to take hold. Those are really important conversations. And certainly, if you go on and you study macroeconomics in university, and many of you will, you'll run into those conversations quite a bit more, and probably in a little bit more depth and detail than we did this year. We certainly spent a lot more time on micro theory than macro theory, even though I think you had a good foundation of just the basics of how this works. Another an important question that government often deals with when it's trying to manage an economy is not just how should it intervene when there's times of trouble, but also how should it perhaps intervene in order to try to look at the economy, look at how even wealth might be distributed among people, and question, is there a fairness, is there a balance, and is there a role for our government to step in and maybe to try to re-even or redistribute wealth in order to make things a little bit more equitable. That focus on distribution of wealth requires a little bit of an underlying theory just in terms of tools that can be used to analyze that information and provide a model of just what's going on. And so today what we're going to be looking at a little bit is the question of how and why should a government care about distribution of wealth, but also be, and more importantly, okay, well, what are some of the fundamental tools that policy analysts will use when they're trying to measure the performance of an economy in terms of wealth distribution, so that they can make important decisions about how to rectify any problems that may determine to exist. It's worth noting, and this really goes back to the first day of the course. If you think back to that first day when we talked about scarcity as a sort of fundamental economic problem, that even though a lot of people would idealize that everybody has what they want within an economy and that there would be no poverty and there would be no imbalance between those with wealth and those who have none, the problem that exists within the economy is that there's only so much stuff. And so that because there's only so much stuff and so much wealth, to be a little bit more specific, there's often a challenge in terms of how do you distribute it and how do you try to make sure that everybody is doing well. Because of the way our governments operate, and because of the fact that we have a capitalist economy where there is a little bit of an invisible hand at work, and there are people with more benefits and more sort of opportunities than others, we do tend to have a little bit of a gap that occurs. Okay? In fact, every country in the world has some gap. Some have more than others, and certainly being able to understand just the nature of that gap, how much of a distribution sort of imbalance do we have between the wealthy and the poor, that's obviously an important consideration for governments. We know that Canada has poverty. If you look at some of the most northern remote communities, particularly among Indigenous peoples within the country, I think there's a pretty universal recognition, regardless of your political strife, that there's a problem, or strife, that there's a problem, and that there's people. I mean, it's hard to believe this is an actual photo from Canada, but it is. There's people who are living in abject, terrible poverty situations that really require help and probably require a little bit of support from the government to make things a little bit more even. Compare that to the average sort of lifestyle that any one of us has, and I think you can see that clearly. There's reason for concern. Given the Canada's capitalist nation, though, there is a question that has to be asked, and the question that has to be asked is that while we are capitalist, we do tend to, believe that there should be some distribution imbalance, at least as a motivating factor. And so, how far should we go to try to make things more even what kind of I guess, rebalancing would be most appropriate. Not everybody's necessarily going to agree on that. Okay, certainly somebody who has a more sort of conservative perspective on the economy probably has a different perspective than the person who's on the NDP would want to see a little bit more balanced, becoming even. But I think everybody at least agrees that there's a need to have some rebalancing to occur. And that's, again, where today's theory really starts to come in. There's a lot of different tools that are used by economists to measure income distribution. And certainly the federal government doesn't just lean on one and say, okay, we've got a quick picture of the economy, that's enough. People who work for the government Ministry of Finance, and really any other ministry that deals with poverty within the government, they're going to have quite a lot of information that's found out through Stats Canada and other research organizations that they can use on a daily basis to make decisions about. One of the most important, though, tools that's used not just in Canada but around the world in order to measure income distribution is something called the Lorenz curve. And we are going to be spending a little bit of time over the next few minutes in this video looking at just what the Lorenz curve is, how it provides a very simple but powerful graphical model of how income is distributed in any nation. Like a lot of these sorts of theories, the Lorenz curve gets its name from a man named Max Lorenz. You don't need to know anything about him other than he was a famous economist a little over 100 years ago. He came up with a pretty simple tool that was probably popular because of just how simple but meaningful it was. And over the time, as people have used it more and more, particularly within not just economics, but also really sort of social studies and social services, who would want to know about income distribution, it kind of took hold and became obviously the Lorenz curve we know today. How does it work? Okay, well, this is what I really wanted to focus in on a little bit with you today in this video. The Lorenz curve is essentially a two-dimensional XY scatter graph that compares two cumulative measures. And cumulative means that they're measures that are added up over time. So you go from 0 to 100, and you're adding from the lowest to the highest number. On the y-axis of your graph, you would measure the cumulative percentage of income. So the first 20%, the next 20%, all the way up to a total of 100, which of course would be all the income of the country. And then on the x-axis, and we do this in quintiles, so I've put this down here, we do it in 5 stages, we would measure the cumulative percentage of the population. So the first entry would be the poorest 20%, and we would look and see how much does that poorest 20% make of the total wealth. Then we would do the first 40, which of course includes the poorest 20, but the next quintile of the next 21 to, I guess, 40 in terms of wealth, if you rank people from poorest to wealthiest. Then the first 60, the poorest 60, the poorest 80, and then finally, of course, your last entry would be 100. If you've been doing things correctly, the last entry, of course, would be 100% of the wealth in the country is controlled by 100% of the population. If you get a number other than 100, then of course the underlying data collection has been flawed in some way. That's obvious. It starts to make more sense if you're looking at this, if you actually start to see some visuals. We'll go through these a little bit together as a group when we meet back again next lesson, but for now you can at least see how this is put together. Essentially, the way the income distribution would be collected would be first that the government would look at things like income tax records and figure out, okay, exactly based on that information, if we ordered people from wealthiest to poorest, what is the share of the total wealth for the country for the last year that's controlled by the first or poorest 20% in that line. You would see here that you would have a number like this. It's always going to be less than 20. It has to be because it's the poorest 20, so of course they're going to be less than 20% of the wealth. And here you would see for a hypothetical country, it's 4.4. The next entry on your Lorenz curve would be the poorest 40. Of course, that includes the first 20, but then you would look at the next group, so it would be 21 through to 39, and you would look at how much does, or 20 to 39, how much does that next 20%, if you're ordering people from poorest to wealthiest, what do they control? You'd see here it's a little bit more, it's 10, add 10 to 4.4, and then that would give you 14.4 for those first two quintiles, or the poorest 40 together. We can continue the process all the way through, and then again, as you'd see at the end, your last entry, the fifth entry, in terms of those 5 quintile points, would be 100% of the wealth, and by default, that of course would become 100. Should the last 20% control a good portion of the wealth compared to the poorest? Of course they should. Okay, at least in terms of the mathematical reality, the wealthiest 20% are going to control far more of the income than the poorest 20. It's just an inevitability. And you can see here in this particular country, the last 20% are essentially controlling nearly 50% of the wealth. So they're clearly an income distribution imbalance that's at play. Now, the Lorenz curve is not a data table. This is the table used to construct the curve, but what it would actually look like is this particular graph right here, and you can see how it works. Now, what you would do if your Lorenz curve is you would plot out how much each of the different quintiles makes in terms of cumulative income. So if you looked at the poorest 20, you'd see 4.4. The poorest 40 was about 14. The poorest 60, I forget the number, but you can see it on and on and on. The poorest 80, I think, was 55. And then finally, the poorest 100, you go up to the top. We also, when we do these graphs, will include a line that goes from 0 to 100 and would essentially represent a perfect equality. So if the poorest 20% earned 20% of the wealth, then you'd have an exactly equal distribution of wealth. Everybody makes the exact same amount. That's the only way that could happen. If that were to occur, and if everybody had perfect equality, then this would be the line that would exist. It's always a theoretical line, though, because of course it's never going to be the reality. And as long as one person makes more than another, then what will happen is that your Lorenz curve will start to actually bow towards the right. Okay, and the more it moves this direction, the more it tends to move into what we're calling area B and makes area A larger, the more uneven your distribution of wealth. Whereas the more the Lorenz curve pulls towards the purple line, the more even your distribution of wealth would be. It's also worth noting, and we'll cover this a little bit in the conversation in your next lesson, the Lorenz curve can't actually be above area A. The reason for that is fairly obvious. If you looked at the poorest 20%, well, the poorest 20% of the population, the most they could even possibly make if they're the poorest 20 would be 20. It would be impossible for the poorest 20 to be earning 30 or 40, because if that were true, then you haven't ordered your population correctly in terms of poorest to wealthiest. It just wouldn't make mathematical sense. Assuming you want perfect equality, then your goal as a country is to pull your Lorenz curve over time towards the pink. Whether or not you would want it actually exactly at that point is a matter of debate. Certainly, a person who's a little bit more left-leaning would probably argue that the fundamental goal of a government has to be to get to perfect equality as close as they can. A person who's a little bit more conservative, maybe a little bit more of a free market idealist, would probably argue that, well, there's benefits to going inward somewhat. I mean, everybody, more or less in Canada, with a few exceptions, believes in an element of social justice, and an unfairly sort of politicized term over the last number of years, by the way. So social justice essentially just means that there's some justice in society. Different people have different definitions of how that's created. But if you believe in an element of social justice, then yes, most people would argue that the curve should move in a little bit, but how much and to what extent, that does start to become a pretty big philosophical debate. And I think there's a number of different positions that can exist that all have merit depending on what you consider to be most important. Now, if you move forward, a couple of points that I'll make, and I've kind of made these, but I'll clarify. If you believe in an ideal world, as I've mentioned, of perfect equality, then you would want your Lorenz curve to push inwards. In practice, however, it's never going to do so. Even in the most socialist or communist type country you might find, there's always going to be a bowing out effect, because it's just impossible not to have that occur. Practical realities of the way that society is organized are going to mean that somebody is going to have more of the pie than others, but some countries might have a little bit more than another might. Like, for example, Sweden is probably going to be further towards the inside because they're a little bit more socialist in terms of their perspective. A country like the United States that's fundamentally based on capitalism and the idea of free market opportunity, well, they're going to pull a little bit more towards the right, because that's just a little bit more of a fundamental principle for a lot of people about how that country should work. Canada, if you look at the Lorenz curve, it also bows outwards. A couple of quick points that are worth noting, and you'll read about these tonight in your homework. Canada is actually pushed further towards the right, which suggests we've had more income inequality over the last 30, 40 years. From the period from about the early part of the century through to about the 1970s, the curve had actually been pulling inwards, and it had been pushing this direction. Since the 1970s, though, as globalization has really become a primary force, you really have started to see the curve move the other direction, which of course suggests that there's more social inequality. Is that a good thing? Well, of course, there's a lot of debate about that. Certainly, a lot of critics would argue that globalization has actually created more of a wealth imbalance, and has actually harmed the average person, particularly within the middle. Government can intervene. Okay, and so certainly one of the questions that often involves within the country is, okay, well, how should government deal with this curve? Should they try to redistribute wealth? Should they try to actually push the curve a little bit back towards the equality line? Now, all governments do some of that pushing. If you think about things like, for example, your income tax, it's inevitable. If you pay income tax in Canada and you earn more money, then another person you pay more tax, and the person who earns less will probably get more benefits. And so there is a little bit of an income redistribution effect. Um, Most people would fundamentally support the idea of some progressivism within the income tax system and some pulling back to the Lorenz curve through government policy. How much, though, that's of course, as I keep saying, I'm going to go on quickly, but that is a matter of debate. An NDPer would probably say this is not enough, go further. A conservative might say, no, that's enough. Okay, there's a certain point at which we need to keep incentives and we need there to be imbalances to motivate people to really have that desire to seek out the carrot on the end of the stick and to push for a little bit more. Now, a final point that I wanted to mention is that when you have a Lorenz curve gives you a quick visual of how income distribution works. But it doesn't really give you a number, and sometimes it's hard to compare because if you think about these lines, if you put different countries on these graphs, some countries might have Lorenz curves that overlap. They may be hard to really compare if they're close together. And so a tool that's often used to go along with the Lorenz curve, and it can be used in a more mathematical, just sort of numerical sense, is something called the Gini coefficient. The measure is pretty straightforward, and I'll show you how it's calculated in a second here. But essentially what it tells you is it tells you how much of the possible equality inequality do you have your current curve representing. Okay, and the closer you get to perfect equality, the lower your Gini coefficient, whereas the further you get away from it and the more inequality you have, the larger your potential gap is and the higher your Gini coefficient. That's probably really confusing in the absence of a graph, and so I'm going to quickly move into the graph and spend a little bit more time here. The Gini coefficient is essentially calculated from the area here that you can see that a Lorenz curve could theoretically represent. We know that a Lorenz curve is not going to be on the perfect equality line. It's going to bow outwards to the right at some angle. We don't know, however, how much the Lorenz curve will pull out. An equal or more equal country will tend to have a low Lorenz curve and a very low value for A in terms of the area of that part of the curve that it represents, whereas a country with a lot of inequality would have that curve pull quite a bit further out and have area A represent much greater total of the possible A plus B. Whatever A is of the total possible A plus B, that's going to be your Gini coefficient. And so to find the Gini coefficient, I'm going to go to this graph to show it. You would take area A, which represents the current, I guess, gap in income, and then you would divide it by the theoretical limit in terms of the gap. Like if one person controlled all the wealth, it would pull all the way out to there. Nobody does, but that would be how it would work. And then that total possible A is a percentage of that. That gives you your Gini coefficient. It's not hard to understand. If you're looking at the Gini coefficient, a low number represents more income equality, whereas a higher number will obviously represent A becoming a larger percentage of its possible total and a greater, I guess, unevenness in terms of wealth distribution. If you look around the world, you'll see that obviously there's different distributions of wealth that will exist. Even if you compare a country like Canada and the United States, we're a little bit cleaner in terms of, or not cleaner, but we're a little bit more even in terms of our Gini coefficient than they are. Okay, which suggests that the more blue you get, the more purple, the more uneven the distribution would be. You start to look at some of these countries like Denmark and Japan, some of the countries in Central Europe and Scandinavia. The reason they're going towards yellow is that those are countries that really push for a more socialist type policy and a little bit more of a distribution evenness and have been able to achieve that. Some of the worst income, unevenness in terms of distribution happens in developing countries. Part of that has to do with just the fact that they're developing. Oftentimes, certain people will benefit from a country that's on the move in terms of the growth of income, but others, of course, will not. Okay, and definitely if you look at a Brazil or if you look at a China to a certain extent or an India, those countries tend to be a lot more uneven. But again, the reason for that is that as they've grown, you've gotten a growth of millionaires within the country, but you've also got a huge population that's very poor. Go to a country like Brazil, go to Rio. Rio is the perfect example of income gaps. You've got the wealthy people who live out by the waterfront, and then you go up to the favelas that are in the north, the sort of shanty towns, and you've got your extreme poverty. Okay, and clearly that's probably not an ideal, but it is something that's common within a country like that. Here you can see different distributions in different parts of the world. You can look this over on your own, maybe pause, make sense of it. You'll notice some parts have more than others. Here you can see, this is interesting. This shows Gini coefficients before and after, I guess, income redistribution. And you'll notice that some countries, like for example, Canada, tend to distribute a little. Some, like Denmark, tend to make a big difference. They actually will really pull back and actually try to make people even. And then there's countries like the United States that really don't make much of an effort at all through things like income tax policy to redistribute. It's a little bit more of a free-for-all, which reflects, I think, the fact that Americans, just in a general sense, tend to believe a little bit more that perhaps having these gaps is a motivating factor. And you can make up your own mind whether or not you agree with that perspective. Here's final graph, which will show you, which is interesting if you're a person who follows politics. Certainly, I find this very interesting. It shows the change in the Gini index or coefficient that existed under different presidents in American history, especially throughout the 20th and early 21st century. And you'll note that when you have the blue, it means that the Gini coefficient had fallen. So there's a significant move towards more evenness in income distribution. Whereas when it goes in this direction, it means that there's more inequality. Typically, red would represent Republicans, and blue would represent Democrats. And with a few exceptions, Clinton being the notable one. If you ever wonder why Clinton gets attacked so much by people on the left, that's part of the picture for why. But for most of the time, Republicans would philosophically be more opposed to income distribution measures, so tend to push the coefficient a little bit in the rightward direction, whereas a Democrat tends to believe a little bit more at equality, at least in terms of income redistribution shifts, and would tend to push things this way. Why is Roosevelt pushing so far? Well, part of it that is that he's president for far longer than any other person. I mean, he's there for well over 12 years. In fact, I think almost 15. You can't be more than 8 since Truman. So in of itself, you couldn't go that long. The other reason for Roosevelt being there is just the fact that that's the New Deal. That's the Great Depression, where the government really did step in to start to redistribute and provide supports to people in trouble. And that was a philosophical shift that moved towards a more Keynesian model that in of itself brought in a great sort of shift in terms of government policy. And it was inevitable that the Gini coefficient would increase or decrease given that sort of shifting landscape. Okay, so that covers pretty much all of the key ideas. I went a little bit longer than I wanted to here, but I think the key idea is that hopefully you've got a clear understanding of what the Lorenz curve is, what the Gini coefficient is, and why they matter, and how they would apply to general policy discussions and economic discussions in the world at large. Your homework for this evening, and you're probably actually going to get 2 nights to do this. Tonight that you have an as you watch sheet, so just finish that. And then the next day, what I want you to do is to read pages 334 to 335. And then there's a worksheet for you to complete with problems on these particular concepts. So good luck, and I'll look forward to seeing you again in your next live lesson.